Welcome back. China has warned Washington that it will not, quote, sit idly if the U.S. deploys missiles on its virtual doorstep here in Asia. Well, Beijing's response on Tuesday came after a flurry of activity over the weekend. On Friday, the U.S. formally withdrew from a 32-year-old arms control agreement from Moscow, and the same day, Russia responded by also terminating the agreement. Then, on Saturday, the new U.S. Secretary of Defense Mark Esper asserted that Washington may soon deploy intermediate-range missiles somewhere in Asia. Esper, who was already viewed as a hawkish politician on China, told media that he'd want this deployment within months. So is China now in the Pentagon's crossfires, or for some reason? And if the U.S. were to actually deploy such missiles in Asia, how might China respond? Joining me today are from Washington, D.C., Dr. Richard Weitz, a security expert from the Wikistrat Global Consultancy, and also here in Beijing, Professor Huang, Dean of the Institution of International and Regional Studies at Beijing Language and Culture University. Thank you so much for joining us, to you both. So let me start with Dr. Weitz first. On August 2nd, the U.S. announced its official termination of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces INF Treaty. Why did the U.S. do this? I mean, why was this so significant?
There were two immediate reasons and then two longer-term reasons. So the first immediate reason was the U.S. Administration under both President Obama and President Trump had decided Russia was cheating on the treaty. They tried to bring Russia back into compliance. That failed, so they decided it made sense for the U.S. unilaterally to enforce a treaty that was not being enforced by Russia. The second proximate reason was concern about the imbalance in the Asia-Pacific region, which we'll talk about today, that China had been developing many thousands of these weapons of this range, that is between 500 and 5,500 kilometers launched from ground, whereas the U.S. was prohibited from having any. But there are two longer-term reasons that basically undermine the treaty. It was very important when it was signed in 1997, but in recent decades, the number of countries that have been getting these weapons was just rapidly increasing. So whereas the Soviet Union and the United States in 1987 had most of these weapons, most advanced missile technology, now dozens of countries have them, not only China, but India, Pakistan, and so on. The second main reason for the weakness of the treaty was that there have been new technologies, new weapon systems that were not thought of, or at least not well understood at the time the treaty was signed, that now can have similar effects to these missiles. And that includes, for example, drones. The only difference being is that they fly to a target and then come back, cyber weapons, space weapons, and so on. So, in essence, the treaty was by narrowly banning weapons that were launched only from the ground and only by Russia and China, was basically being overtaken by events. And so that's why the treaty collapsed.
Professor Huang, your take on this? Was the U.S. justified to withdraw?
I think that the two approaches. One approach, of course, is to just abandon the treaty, or abandon what we have achieved, and then do it all over again. But I think that's not a really good approach, because that makes us more chaotic and confusing. I agree with Richard just said that the technology is developing, and more countries have this kind of weapons. We need to have something to have them under control. But that's why I think the second approach might be better. That is, we improve on what we have already achieved. That is, the treaty at least is binding for two superpowers, nuclear superpowers, United States and Russia. And if we really believe that the situation has changed, we need some new rules of the game and new treaties to make sure peace can be sustained, then we can try to improve based on the treaties, but not to just do away with it altogether. I think that, in my view, is more damaging and more, potentially more chaotic for the situation where we have.
And on Saturday, August the 3rd, the U.S. Defense Secretary Mark Esper told American media that he advocates for deploying intermediate-range missiles in Asia in a few months. The timing doesn't seem coincidental. I mean, since the U.S. had withdrawn from the INF Treaty just the day before, it just seemed to me that it's all well planned. and suddenly it has a new plan to deploy in Asia. I mean, Professor Huang, do you think that this has been in the works for a while?
I think that, just like Richard just said, that one major reason for the United States to do away with the treaty is that they think China is making a great progress in this kind of area. So therefore, the balance, the so-called balance, has been broken. But the counter argument is that you do this without consulting a major player you're targeting, that is China, without any consultation at all, and all of a sudden you began to claim that you're going to deploy this country weapons in the China's neighborhood, and which we know that is already caused a great row in China. The United States deployed THAAD in South Korea a couple of years ago, but this time this kind of what I call the surprise and unilateral move, of course, will not do well with China and other countries. That's why China has made such a very tough response to this kind of unilateral action by the United States.
Right, and Esper was known to be a hawk on China. I mean, some observers suggested that the Pentagon policy would mostly remain the same under his leadership, but now the seemingly dramatic shift in policy with an aggressive new stance toward China. Dr. Weitz, how surprising are these moves?
Not at all. I mean, this was under discussion for years, that the option, one, there was this growing imbalance that China, not being restricted by the treaty, was developing many of these weapons, primarily aimed at Taiwan, but also Japan and other targets. And many of the people who were concerned about this argued the U.S. should withdraw from the treaty to basically counter this situation by deploying its own missiles. And so this debate had been going on for years, and so I think the Chinese government knew this was coming. The U.S. and Russia had proposed to multilateralize the treaty. About a decade ago, they jointly submitted something to the General Assembly of the UN and so on. But no other countries were really enthusiastic about limiting these weapons for them. So, in essence, in particular, if China was really concerned, it would have said, well, okay, we will sign on to this treaty as well. But that would require China to eliminate its main missile force, since almost all of its missiles are in this range. So we figure at this point what the most likely outcome is that the U.S. will have some weapons of this range that can be launched by ground, which will put in Guam, but maybe just keep a lot of them in the West Coast for emergency deployment. Meanwhile, the treaty does not prohibit weapons launched from ships, and so the U.S. has some of these missiles already on ships.
Now, China showed its concern about the announced plan by the U.S. I want to play a soundbite of how China's foreign ministry responded. Take a listen of this.
We call on the U.S. to exercise restraint, and I also want to make one point absolutely clear, that China will not stand idly by, and we're forced to take countermeasures should the U.S. deploy intermediate range ground-based missiles in this part of the world.
All right, Professor Huang, you heard what's been said by the foreign minister. What's your take on how China is going to respond to this new development? How would you expect them to do moving forward?
I think China does have some options in doing this. As Richard said, China has been developing this kind of weapons for a while and has certain degree of advantage. I think one major point that China has to make clear is that since this also mid-range missile being launched from the ground, China can take some actions for so-called countermeasures to make sure that such weapon will not be deployed in the countries around China or close to China, including U.S. allies such like South Korea and Japan. So the countermeasures is not just vis-a-vis United States per se, but also with those countries or U.S. allies who would cooperate with United States, allow the deployment of such missiles, weapons on their ground. And China with, so countermeasures is very, in my view, is a kind of a complete set of actions China can take, but not just one action.
All right, final take over to you, Dr. Weitz. Are we close to a military confrontation?
Oh, no, I still think that's far off. I mean, this is part of this. There's clearly a worsening of relations between China and the U.S. on all sorts of spheres. We've seen the trade and economic ties collapse. We've seen disputes over Taiwan and over other issues. But there's no desire in either country to engage in any kind of direct military confrontation. I mean, that beyond these kind of deployments, maneuvering. In many ways, the reasons why both countries are signaling their desire to strengthen their defenses are precisely to avert such a confrontation and make sure that there's no misunderstanding on the other side what might happen.
All right, that's all the time we have for on this edition of The Point. Thank you very much, Dr. Weitz, joining us there via satellite, and Professor Huang joining me here in the Beijing studio. As always, follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with Liu Xin. Download the CGTN app to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thank you for your company. You've got The Point.